Good afternoon. Just taking a few seconds because a lot of people have registered for this event this afternoon. So just giving a few seconds for everyone to join before we get underway. So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. Today, focusing solely on the outcome of this week's Special European Council. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. And our special guest will be joining us in the second half to discuss what happened at the summit in relation to migration. We'll be welcoming Helena Hahn, Policy Analyst in the EPC's European Migration and Diversity Programme. As always, Update is a totally interactive conversation, questions from me to our panel, and I hope later from all of you. You know the drill. If you want to speak, please click on the raised hands button. And when the time comes, I will allow you to talk. If you prefer to write your questions, please use the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A. And please, please, please be as brief as possible so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it is for. And one other thing to mention, as this event is organised in the framework of a project co-funded by the European Union, we'd like to ask you please to fill in an evaluation survey. You will see a link to that survey appear in the chat. If it's not there now, it will be within a matter of seconds. You will also get an email after the event. If you don't do it during the event, please, please, please do send us your evaluation. It really is very valuable and important to us to get your feedback. I suggest perhaps you do it, don't want to distract you too much from our discussion, but do it during the session so you don't forget before you embark on the weekend. But thank you very much in advance for doing that. So let's dive straight in. And Janis, maybe I could start with you just in terms of, this was a special European Council, so-called. Why did we have it? Why did Charles Michel, President of the Council, decide that we needed, in the end, it became a summit as much about Ukraine as everything else. We'll come back to that in a moment. But why did he decide to call this summit to focus on the issue of migration and the economy? Couldn't it have waited till the March summit?
Well, it was decided and it was called for at the end of last year. And if you remember, at the European Council in December, there were a good number of members, especially Austria, but also others, putting pressure to have a discussion, a thorough discussion on migration. And there were others, or most of them, saying that there's a need to have a discussion on how to react, especially to the Inflation Reduction Act of the Americans. So there was this pressure at the time, which would have then also undermined the work of the European Council in December. So a decision was taken to take up the issue in February and also to prepare adequately in order to be able to have a discussion among member states, especially because it was clear, and we will be discussing about that, that there are major differences when it comes to these issues, migration, the reaction to the IRI. And so that was the main reason why they went for the Special European Council, when we all did not know that Zelensky would be joining.
Indeed not. And Fabian, on that point about Zelensky, the visit, which was kept not a secret as it was supposed to be, but the visit to the council more so than the visit to the parliament, amid the prospect of a massive new offensive by Russia. To what extent did that become the dominant issue? Obviously, it captured the headlines, it captured the images. Did it also overshadow the other discussions? And did they, I mean, Zelensky made a very strong appeal for more help, for more support. He also made a very strong appeal on EU membership. But did it amount to more in the end than just a sort of rallying of support amid concerns that the EU's unity might start to fracture, that it might start to get war fatigue? What was really Zelensky's objective, do you think, and did he achieve it?
I think it's not as straightforward as being able to say there was only one objective. Clearly, part of it was to provide a signal that Ukraine is continuing to fight, is continuing to also ask for support, and is continuing to work with the allies, which it has. And that, I think, was a very important signal. And I think in that sense, we have to see this as a very positive move. And I think the discussions about where he went first and who he saw, I think that's frankly rather ridiculous. I mean, we are talking about someone who is coming from a war zone, has to put his personal safety at risk to come. So I think this is really the context in which we need to see that. Did it change something about the discussions at the summit? I'm not sure it did, because ultimately, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, but ultimately we didn't make much progress. Would we have had more progress if he hadn't been there? I don't think so. And also on some of the specific issues he was asking for, while there were a lot of supportive words, while there was generally a very positive signaling towards Ukraine, but concretely, there wasn't very much on the table. And in particular, when we're talking about the enlargement question, we have essentially kicked the can down the road.
And indeed, I mean, he said, talking about the question of EU membership, he said, for Ukraine, it is the way home, it is our way home. He appealed for accession talks, Janis, to start this year. Ursula von der Leyen saying very much, no, there is no rigid timeline. It's what she called a merit-based progress. And when you look at the conclusions, they simply say the EU acknowledges Ukraine's determination to meet the necessary requirements in order to start accession negotiations as soon as possible. Doesn't say anything about the EU's determination to accelerate the progress. What should we read into that?
Well, no, it doesn't say that. I think the fact that it's acknowledging that things are moving on the Ukrainian side, which it is doing, they're very professional when it comes to preparing for the accession talks, for preparing to enter the European Union as they see it. But on the side of the EU, we see this hesitancy. We see that there are some who argue we need to be careful in not creating expectations, which we might not be able to fulfill. On the other hand, you want to send a strong signal, political signal, that they are part of the European family, and this is exactly what is happening. But for example, if you look into the other side of the coin, I was talking about Ukraine preparing itself to potentially joining at some point in time, at least that is their aspiration. The other side of the coin being that the EU needs to prepare for that moment. And we see when it comes to that front, we're not actually moving. So there is a discrepancy between both sides. But just to underline what Fabian was saying with respect to how significant was this, I think it was very significant because it also shows that what is at stake is much larger than the issues which sometimes are being discussed in the European Council. This is about not only helping Ukraine, but also determining on what the future of Europe should look like, on how we will eventually react to what's called the watershed, the Zeitenwende, so that we should not go back to business as usual, but that we should rather reflect on what actually is needed and deliver on that. Now, if you see that message, and I think that was what we saw during the day, and then you see the discussions in the evening, in the afternoon, in the evening, in the night on migration and the economy, you see the big discrepancy between, on the one hand, seeing how significant this moment is, how big the challenges are, and then having a discussion which probably would have been the same even if Zelensky would have not come to town yesterday. So there is this discrepancy between the realities on the ground and the necessities which are being symbolized when you have someone like Zelensky being in town.
Indeed, and we will come back to both those issues in just a moment, but I just wanted to, on the issue of support for Ukraine, and particularly on the issue of fighter jets, because I'm wondering whether we are likely to see, we appear to be seeing more and more countries becoming open to the possibility of providing them. Is this going to be like the tanks discussion, only in an accelerated way, given, I mentioned at the beginning, this concern about a massive new offensive from Russia, speed being of the essence, Zelensky saying, look, it's not just about the new things we need, it's about, please send me what you've promised. And ironically, the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, telling everybody to hurry up. I found that quite ironic. I don't know how much of a shift that signals on other issues in relation to military support for Ukraine. Do you sense that the tide, just to stay with you for a minute, Janis, the tide is or will turn on fighter jets?
I don't know whether it will turn, but you can clearly see that there is a change of attitude, that there is a change in terms of the emergency, and that people are understanding that potentially the counteroffensive of Russia, which potentially even has already started. And that there is a fear that what we were seeing in September, October, November of last year, where there was this feeling that Ukrainian forces are regaining ground, are on the upper side, and that there is now a feeling that potentially the Russian offensive might even be successful, or more successful than what they have been doing in the past, that they have been preparing for this. So this fear, I think, is driving member states also to understand that more support is needed, also more military support. I think that's something which plays into the equation in Berlin. And the fact that Berlin has taken, after a long, hesitant way to get there, the decision to provide Leopard 2 and, is now also making the German chancellor putting pressure on others, which I think is good. Now the question is, how far will that go? But I think it's a very much fear-driven.
Fabian, in terms of what you read into Scholz's change of tone as well as of substance, do you think this signals a really fundamental shift, and that Germany will be much more open to responding to requests right across the board of military support for Ukraine than it has in the past? Or is it simply a sort of, look, I've done, Scholz in a sense saying, you all put a lot of pressure on me when I was evaluating carefully and weighing it up. So now, having put the pressure on me, you put your money where your mouth is. I.e., is it about Germany moving much faster, or is it about, I've now done it, you do it too?
Well, I think it's an interesting question whether also the self-perception of Germany and of the Chancellor here plays into this. I know the assessment from the outside has been that it's been far too slow, that it's been far too hesitant, that it displayed a lack of understanding of the bigger picture. When you're talking to people within the German system, you hear a very different story. You actually hear that what he has done was exactly right, and that he has acted wisely, and that this course of action was the right one. So in a sense, I think this is about him positioning himself at the forefront of support for Ukraine, saying that ultimately, and it is true that Germany has now it has gone over that hurdle, is actually providing very substantive support. But I think the question of the fixed-wing aircraft, that's a very different one, because that truly is one which will have to be answered by the alliance as a whole. This is not something an individual country can really do, also because if we are talking about it in the context of the spring offensive, there are only certain aircraft which would be useful at this moment in time, because you will have to have pilots which are trained on those aircraft. You will have to have the system to support them. So I think this is an attempt of Germany to regain a little bit of the front foot in this. Whether it works or not, I don't know. But ultimately, I think, as we have seen also over the last year, the developments on the ground are going to drive the reaction. And things which might look slow at the moment, they will happen because ultimately the necessities are.
Absolutely. I want to move on to the economy and particularly the question of state aids, but Janis, you wanted to add something.
Just one point, because if you talk to people who know Scholz very well, also from his own party, one thing you will often hear is that when he has a position, he often is, it seems, to be very stubborn. He sticks to it. He follows a certain line which he's defined, and he sticks to it. Once you are able, or once the situation has changed his mind, he will be as stubborn once he has changed his position. So if this is true, and you now try to translate that to the decision regarding Leopards, it could be that you might now see a chancellor who is more pushy, much more than he had been, because he has changed his attitude towards the question. It's an hypothesis, but you will hear that very often in Berlin, that this is a trait which is very close to his character.
Thank you for that insight. Let's move on to the two issues. And we want to start with the economy, and then we'll bring Helena in to talk about migration, probably the most difficult, the most fractious issue of the summit. But on the economy, Fabian, in terms of resolving their differences over state aid rules, how do we respond to the US Inflation Reduction Act? Just to remind everybody, this argument that if you now allow member states a lot more flexibility on state aid so that they can pump subsidies, green subsidies into their industries, you will undermine the single market, the level playing field. That on one side of the argument. On the other, the countries with the deepest pockets who could support their industries most, Germany and France, calling for more relaxation. How did it come out? The conclusions of the summit make it look as if there was a compromise, but how much of a compromise, and will it stick? Will it hold?
I think it is very difficult to talk about a compromise when in the end we will have a decision to do one thing or the other. What we have here is a compromise, in my view, to kick the can down the road, to not make the difficult decisions at this moment in time. But it doesn't change anything about the underlying differences between the member states. And the underlying differences, I would say we have three groups of countries. We have one group of countries which still believes that there shouldn't be any changes, fundamental changes to competition policy, to state aid, who haven't recognized that the world has changed. We have one group of countries which essentially wants to renationalize state aid policy, wants to renationalize competition policy so that they can do whatever they want in terms of supporting the industry. And we have a third group of countries which will be happy if there's a pot of money at the European level, which they can use as freely as possible. I think that's going to be the compromise we're going to get at the end. We're going to move some degree towards renationalization, but always emphasizing that we have to safeguard the single market. We're gonna move some way towards more money, but most of it not new money, repackaging what is there. And all of that put together, unfortunately, is exactly the wrong answer. Because what we should be doing is talking about a common European industrial policy where we do these things together, where we think strategically about what this means for Europe, where we already anticipate what is coming after the Inflation Reduction Act, what is going to happen to the multilateral system, what is going to happen with China. These are all the kind of things we should be talking about. But in the end, that's not on the agenda. On the agenda will be a European compromise, which unfortunately, in my view, doesn't address the question and actually undermines the single market and undermines competitiveness.
And if you look at the conclusions, they refer to, quote, simpler, faster and more predictable rules on when governments can help companies, but they do emphasize, this is the can kicking, emphasize the need to protect the single market. And Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, said afterwards that any relaxation of the rules would be, quote, temporary, targeted and very much focused on innovation. So trying to walk that tightrope, but you indicated, just to follow up with you before I come back to Janis, on the money question, was there any movement, any real discussion? It doesn't look like it from the conclusions, of potential new solidarity instruments, this idea that if it's done at EU level, then we protect the single market and we have a response to the Inflation Reduction Act. Did they discuss it at all? It looked much more like they were talking about how to spend existing money better, and they talk about efficient implementation of instruments. Is there really any, what can we expect, Fabian, from the European Sovereignty Fund? Are there any other ideas floating around at the moment?
I think the first group of countries I was talking about are also very strong on saying there should be no new money. If we do need to spend money, and they're even questioning whether it's necessary to use public money to do this, but if we do use money, then it should come from existing pots. Recovery and Resilience Fund hasn't been drawn down anywhere near the degree of the provisions which are there. So I think this is essentially at the moment is to say, no, nothing new. Let's just use what is there. Let's try to simplify I would be very interested to put these conclusions next to probably a few hundred other summits where they have said exactly the same thing. And the only bit where they touched on new money is the European Sovereign Fund, which they have kicked decisively down the road because they have said that ultimately they are now waiting. They have noted the Commission is working on this, and now they're waiting for the Commission to come with something they can shoot down.
Janis, for you, can kicking or constructive ambiguity of the type the EU is famous for, which leaves the door open to come up with new ideas? What's your sense of the balance of the argument here? Are you as frustrated as Fabian?
I think it's a mixture of both. Yes, we're kicking down the can. At the same time, if you look into the Council conclusions, and you were referring to that, Jacki, already, you see that it is exactly a mix of the different positions which Fabian was describing. And by the way, one element you could have added to the description, Fabian, when you are categorizing member states or actors into groups, you can also categorize them with respect to how to react to the Inflation Reduction Act, because some countries feel that we need to be very tough. We need to use it as an opportunity to change the way in which we are supporting our industries. Others are arguing, well, we can still hope that we can find a compromise, that we will be treated similar to our Canada and Mexico are being treated. And then you have von der Leyen, who's always signaling when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, saying, well, at the end of the day, China is more important. Let's not forget that, which is preparing the grounds to do something which goes beyond the RRA if a solution is being found to that. And the fact that in the Council conclusion, you simply take note of the European Sovereignty Fund. Whenever you read the words take notes, that is probably less than kicking down the can down the road. It's postponing issues, it's postponing things. It's also telling to the Commission, be careful in what you want to present, because otherwise we're going to shoot it down immediately. So I think the signals which are coming are extremely mixed, which means that at the end of the day, everything will be determined on how things develop on the ground. And there's a lot of appreciation that, you know, things are not developing badly. We're somewhat getting control of the situation. Even inflation is going down. So there is an attitude out there where the pressure seems to be decreasing, and where, you know, business as usual with some tweaks here and there is sufficient.
And on that point about those who argue that the pressure is decreasing, Fabian, I just wanted to put to you something I've seen reported on in the last few days, which is some people beginning to argue that actually the concern about the Inflation Reduction Act, that there will be a massive flight of investment to take advantage of green subsidies in the US, that this is overblown and it won't have that serious an impact, and that this is simply being used as a pretext by that group you mentioned, the second group you mentioned, the renationalizers of state aid policy, as a pretext to relax state aid rules. Is there any justification for that argument, or do you share the concerns of those who believe, no, this is fundamental, add in China later on, but the Inflation Reduction Act does pose a serious challenge and we have to find some response to it, whether it's at European level or otherwise?
I think if we were only talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, then you might have this argument. Some people might say, well, it won't have quite the impact people think. The money split over a number of years, etc. But that is not the context in which we should be looking at this. We should be looking at this within a fundamental challenge to European competitiveness, to European long-term policies like climate change mitigation, where it is not only the US, but even within the US, you should see the Inflation Reduction Act together with energy prices, for example, where Europe is far disadvantaged. We should see it together with the global developments, where we're seeing that essentially the multilateral system is very sick, or maybe it's even dead, and where countries are starting to do more and more what they want to do, especially if they're big and powerful. We should see this in the context of a strategic consideration of how do we deal with China? How do we deal with international trade in technological goods, which are very sensitive? How do we deal with economic security, resource security? So this is not an individual issue. Unfortunately, we are actually becoming even more inward-looking, even more narrow when it comes to these issues. What we should be looking at is the whole landscape and start to talk about not whether this will affect the competitiveness of European industry over the next few months, but what does this mean over the next 10 years? And that is really the discussion we should have. But if you have that discussion, you very quickly come to a discussion around saying, what are the things we are going to have to do together? Because they simply do not work anymore if you do them country by country.
And just a quick follow-up to that, and then I want to take a couple of questions from our audience on Ukraine, which I'll put to you, Janis, and then we'll bring Helena in. But Fabian, just on that point, the summit conclusions refer to the fact that the next EU summit in March will discuss a strategy at EU level to boost competitiveness and productivity. What is it likely to include? Is it likely to just be more words? You indicated earlier your frustration with not grasping the nettle of the scale of the challenge. What is this strategy likely to be? And are you more optimistic that it will rise to the occasion, as it were?
I wish I could be, but I think when we are talking about strategy, we are also talking about hard choices. We're talking about breaking taboos, doing things differently than you have done them before. I think what Janis was already indicating, that we have this situation where, yes, people talk about the watershed, but the actions which follow from that are nothing like you would expect in an era of fundamental change. So yes, we are going to re-emphasize all of the things which we always emphasize when we have discussions around competitiveness. We are going to talk about the importance of the single market, the importance of a global multilateral system, and there will be very little in there which really looks the global reality straight into the face and says we have to make much more fundamental changes.
Okay, let me take these couple of questions on Ukraine, and then I'd like to bring Helena in. One from Joe Lynan asking, membership of Ukraine in the EU is the bigger question. Were there any elements in the summit discussion, Janis, on how to proceed and what it will mean for the EU architecture? And Just van Eersel says, you say developments on the ground in Ukraine are pushing reactions. This does not sound strategic. To what extent do you feel there is any clear strategy of the EU, or is it fully relying on Washington? This relates also, says Just, to the hard dilemma, escalating, de-escalating. It looks like the West wants both. A clear choice has not yet been made. Look at the discussion on aircraft. The more we hesitate, says Just, the more we are on the defensive. How do you look at this? So membership and the strategy or lack thereof, Janis.
Well, when it comes to the EU architecture, as Joe Lyman called it, there was no decision taken, and actually there is no discussion about it. There is an emphasis when it comes to Ukraine and potential membership at some point in time, which is fully concentrating on how to support Ukraine in the current situation, potentially also thereafter. But when it comes to discussing the future EU architecture in order to prepare the EU for potentially new members joining the club at some point in time, maybe also Ukraine at some point in time, we're actually not moving. There's no appetite to move in that direction. And there's a feeling among also those who on paper say that we are ready to reform the EU, also ready to even, they argue, ready to reform the EU treaties, that they then argue, as long as we don't have an agreement among the EU 27 to proceed in that direction, at least to start that process, it doesn't make sense. So we're not talking about changing the EU's architecture. That is something which is not, I don't see changing in the European Council or at the level of the European Council.
And strategy or lack thereof?
Well, I think that, and we've been discussing this for a long time, in many ways there is a lack of strategy. And when it comes to how to actually deal or support, or to what degree to support Ukraine, we see that there are huge differences of opinion, by the way, not only between member states, but also between the EU member states and other allies, but also differences within EU countries where you have discussions about how to deal with the situation, how far to go, how far not to go. So in terms of the strategic thinking, even with respect to the question of now concretely supporting Ukraine, if I understood the question correctly, we're not moving in that direction.
Thank you very much. And I know you want to come in, Fabian, but let me add to that. Dimitri Korpakis says, should we be moving to a real near-war economy by reinforcing the European defence industry through repurposing part of the resources of Next Generation EU? Within a few months, he says, the need for additional weapons and ammunition may become critical. Brief one, if you would. I want to bring Paul Taylor in, who had his hand raised but has written his question, but I'd like to hear from him. And then I want to bring Helena in. So let's try and do all that in a couple of minutes. Fabian.
I was going to answer exactly Dimitri's question with reference to what we just talked about before. There is no strategy. So when we look at the defense sector, it is ultimately without any direction. We don't know where we are going. We don't know what is actually the goal. And that has a repercussion for many different areas. It's not only in the area of how do we resupply our military, or how do we supply also new weapons to Ukraine. It's about also industrial policy. It's about where are we going to have these centers of growth. There's going to be an enormous amount of money going into the defense industry. Is that going to be European industry? Is it going to be American industry? Is it going to be procured in common, or are we going back to the massive amount of inefficiency we've seen before? But none of these questions are even on the table. And in no area, and this is just an example, in no area are we having the strategic discussion to say, where is it we want to go, and how do we then get there?
And in the defense sector, even at the national level, we're not progressing. If you look into, we're almost 1 year after the big Zeitenwende speech of Scholz, 100 billion putting into the German Bundeswehr. If during that year, almost nothing has happened. It's a lost year. So also at the national level, we're not getting the message of what needs to be done.
Paul Taylor, I have opened your mic. Would you like to put your question to Janis and Fabian?
Hello, folks. It's wonderful.
Hello, good to hear from you, sir.
Things from sunny Provence. My question is I guess the fundamental, it is a strategy question, and you've sort of already answered it. My question is, do EU leaders understand that Ukraine is fighting for our freedom? And have they made efforts to convey this to their public, or are they still stopping short of that? And are they maybe afraid to try to do that if they believe it themselves?
Fabian wants to come in. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Good to hear from you. I'm really afraid that they might understand, because if they do understand and still don't do what is necessary, that's even more worrying. And I think this is exactly what is happening now. When you actually talk to many of the people involved in decisions at the highest level, there's, at least in rhetoric, there's a recognition of many of these things we've been talking about today. But it doesn't translate into action. It doesn't translate into a willingness to make the compromises, show the leadership which is necessary to get these policy areas, whatever policy areas, moving. And when we are looking about how leaders have communicated with their constituencies, not only their citizens, but also even within their own small political constituencies, they are giving a very different message. They're giving a message about, we can handle this, it's not that important. In the end, look at energy, we've managed to get through the worst of it. So the recognition of the gravity of the moment, the difficulties which are still to come, because up to now was the easy part. Up to now was the reaction to what was happening. Now comes the bit which is far more difficult, and leaders are not even starting to communicate about this.
I do want to bring Helen in now, because the conversation about migration was the most difficult, the most fractious, kept them up till 3 o'clock in the morning, and is delighted to have you with us, Helena, to try and make sense of what emerged from that. Already got a question in the Q&A, but I'm going to wait on that just for a moment. Just in terms of going back to a question I asked Janis at the beginning about Why this conversation now? Why the need for a special European Council? And was it simply in response to those calls from some member states looking at the high numbers? Or was it at all any part of a broader strategy to try and unblock the negotiations on the Migration and Asylum Pact? Was it short-termist and very much focused on a specific issue? Or was it an attempt to be more strategic in this area?
I think the answer is somewhere in between. Building on what Janis said in the beginning, we have to recall that it was the whole question around Schengen accession that I would say kickstarted promulgations by various member states about how the system currently is broken. In the beginning, this was in relation to Schengen, then it shifted to the implementation of Dublin and harmonization of asylum rules. And now we've sort of ended up focusing on what is often called the external dimension of EU migration policy. So in relation to returns, increasing migration cooperation with third countries, notably with countries of origin, as well as readmission agreements. And there's all kinds of ideas about what that could look like. Again, we can talk about the conclusions and perhaps the language that is used and some of the ambitions that are set out in that. But I think the important question to ask is, based on the statements and reflections by member states that the system is broken, have we actually seen any follow-up to that? Again, I don't want to sort of shy or, shift the attention too much away from what is said in the conclusions, but at this point, we don't really have any sense of when member states might re-engage on the question of Schengen accession. And we know that this is a particular concern to Bulgaria and Romania. And we also don't really have a sense of how discussions around solidarity and responsibility sharing are going to continue. Now, there's good reason to say we're not going to dedicate a special summit to these questions right now. But I think there's sort of a bit of a gap between what the original intentions were and what has been discussed at this.
There was nothing in the conclusions about responsibility sharing, of sharing the burden at all. There was one reference, I think, to legal migration, but nothing at all. So it was incredibly, there's a question from Bernd Rigat in our audience saying, Miss Maloney was very content with the council conclusions on migration. Is that a reason, he says, to be suspicious? Is the council heading to Fortress Europe? Just to be clear before you answer that, Helena, they talked and agreed that the EU should provide more support, more help for border protection, as they called it. But there was an argument, a very Trumpian argument about fences and who should pay for them. What actually did they agree? Is the issue of funding fences on the table, or has it been taken off definitively? How do you read where they actually got to and what the conclusions tell us about the way forward?
I think talking only about the question of border protection, border fences, walls, whatever you may want to call it, countries such as Austria and the signatories of the letter by 8 member states, which included the Baltics, Denmark, Austria, Malta, Greece, and then apparently also Hungary yesterday evening. In their view, this is being considered a success. They can go home and they can tell their voters, we came back with a very concrete commitment that the EU will fund the kind of infrastructure that we feel is urgently needed.
But the conclusions talk about surveillance, don't they? They don't talk about infrastructure in that sense.
Well, in EU language, the term infrastructure is used and it can mean all kinds of things. And this is already standard practice prior to the decision today. I think this is also important to remember. There's a roughly 7.4 billion euros that are dedicated under the current multi-annual financial framework. And we can expect that around 3 or a bit more are still left over. So any question or any debate around additional funding, I'm not really sure what that exactly means, precisely because there is already funding in place.
And do you, answering Bernd, do you think we are heading towards Fortress Europe?
I think this is a very short-term way to say, all right, we have a solution. And I also think that at the end of the day, this is really more about the symbolics, and it has a strong signaling effect. But I don't really expect that this to be, followed up with any sort of quantifiable or very visible impact. I think we need to look at other areas when it comes to actually changing how things are being done in practice.
Before I bring Janis and Fabian back in on this one, just in terms of, as you say, it's a short-term answer, so people can go home and say to the electorates, look what we've done. There were calls, and we come back here to Chancellor Scholz, among others, who did underline again the need for a balanced solution, that we need also to increase opportunities for legal migration, and say I only found one passing reference to legal migration. Instead, the discussion was all on the issues that you have highlighted. I mean, do you think there is any prospect of that bigger debate about what the economy of Europe needs and how we address this issue in a more balanced way? Or do you fear that side of the equation is off the table for the foreseeable future? And then I'm going to come to Janis and Fabian, and I also see some hands already raised in our audience. But Helena.
We've seen these dynamics play out in the past beforehand, and so I personally am not surprised to see this reference in passing to legal migration. Rarely has it been fleshed out, and in fact, in this case, Germany really was in a rather isolated position in saying, well, if we are going to talk about sticks, we also need to talk about carrots. And so again, while it is mentioned in the conclusions, Germany is really more in an isolated position. There are, of course, some other member states that recognize the value in that. And I would also say that there can also be a downside to making too strong of a link between enforcing returns and then saying, well, we'll use legal migration pathways, because in practice, it turns out to be much more complicated to build up systems that allow for that. That doesn't mean that not more work should be done around it, but it just means that, as you were saying, the vision is not really there yet. And the conclusions at least suggest that member states aren't really at this point in time willing to talk about it, but that does not at all mean that there's not an urgent necessity to do so.
Janis, your reading, are we headed towards Fortress Europe? And you said at the beginning, this discussion, as with the economy, was illustrating that EU leaders were not waking up to the fundamental Zeitenwende, yet another illustration of that. What is your broader reading of what these discussions tell us about the way forward?
Well, first of all, I think that Helena's right. When you were asking her about the Fortress Europe, if I understood you correct, Helena, the response she was giving was, that is not a solution. It might seem as if it is a solution, but it is not a solution. However, if you take a step back and you ask yourself also, if you compared the discussion they had tonight and the discussion we're having now compared to where we were some years ago, there is a clear indication that the trend is moving towards the narrative of a fortress. We are trying to secure ourselves in terms of our borders, secure ourselves in terms of making sure that the numbers of people arriving and knocking on Europe's door are lower than they are currently, and securing that people can be sent back to the countries of origin and transit. So that's the message which is being sent out. And that is reflecting an overall political mood. And the bad thing about that, and that's the second element I want to mention in terms of, not only is this the wrong thing to do because it doesn't solve the challenges which we are facing, but it's also giving a totally negative appreciation and picture of the issue of migration, as if migration is something we should only fear, whereas migration has been a part of our history for always. It is something which we require. It is something which is also significant in terms of the role we want to play also globally, how we signal to our partners of what kind of an actor we are. And then also the economic aspects of making sure that we need migration because it is in our economic interest. And by the way, also in Germany, you have a strong debate about that, and it's now tilting in that direction. A debate which we should have had already 10 or 15 years ago, but okay. So I think we're moving the issue of migration into a negative field, which actually, from a strategic perspective, is exactly what we don't want, because we need to be treating migration in a totally different way. But the council conclusions are full of the security aspects. They're full of elements which at the end of the day convey the message of, we have taken the decision, which is that we are moving towards a fortress, which is the wrong message even to send.
Fabian?
I'm in danger of repeating myself because I think what it shows is that we are unable to think strategically about these kind of issues. And I think what we're seeing with many countries, if not all of them, is what I would call the British disease. Basically, everyone says we can't move at the European level because we can't sell it at home. And if you're already starting into these discussions with that kind of attitude, if you're already starting into the discussions with this very negative, we need to really talk about how do we stem the flow, how do we, the very fearful thing, then you're not going to get anywhere. And that's exactly, I think, what we have. And I don't see very much hope for the future, I have to say. I don't see that there is any willingness of any of the member states to really try to resolve some of the underlying issues. And this has repercussions. It has repercussions, just to make one connection, but there are many connections. But for example, we are wondering how far can Europe continue to rely on support in the rest of the world when it comes to the war in Ukraine? Now, part of that question will be answered by how do we treat other countries? How do we treat migration? How do we deal with agriculture? How do we deal with all of the issues which are affecting the lives of people in our neighborhood, particularly in Africa? So we are not willing to have those discussions, and for that reason, we're not going to resolve the issues.
I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience in a moment. And Helena, I'll come back on that long-term future, but I want to link to what Fabian was just saying in terms of the way the rest of the world perceives it. And you talked about carrots and sticks earlier on. And what sorts of carrots and sticks are we talking about with this focus on returns, on putting pressure on countries to take back rejected asylum seekers? I mean, the Council conclusions talk, and I quote, about using all relevant EU policies, instruments and tools, including diplomacy, development, trade and visas, all of which it looks like are going to become an instrument of Fortress Europe, if I read that. How do you read that? What sort of things concretely are being discussed?
In fact, I think this is a statement that we've seen being recycled again and again. It's very common to see all of these put under one umbrella. And I think the important thing to remember is that while a discussion at EU level can happen, any kind of measures really need to be tailored to the country in question. There cannot be sort of a blanket approach in saying we think that development aid should be reduced in the hopes that that will sort of effectuate, an increased motivation or willingness by countries of origin to take back their, rejected asylum seekers. What is on the table currently is, in addition to diplomacy, so engaging more with partner countries, is also, again, questions around development aid. What that should look like in practice remains somewhat unclear. We, of course, also have to consider that this is ongoing against the background of reallocations in the EU's development and humanitarian budget, including in light of the war in Ukraine, but also the crisis in Afghanistan. In addition to that, there's been a lot of talk around visa policies, and there's a specific component of the visa code that allows the EU to impose restrictive measures should cooperation not be deemed to be as needed. I have to say, for context, in general, this has been, I think, used more as a way to threaten, but has rarely ever been followed up in practice. The only example to date is in the case of the Gambia. The number of rejected asylum seekers from the Gambia are comparatively small when we look at other populations such as Syrians, Afghans, etc. So there, the question is sort of, well, at what cost are these restrictive measures then imposed? Do they punish the elite that can likely afford to wait for longer, that can likely afford to pay higher visa fees, or do they actually punish the regular population that has very little to do? And so what I'm trying to say is that it raises, I think, a lot of more sort of normative questions about how does the EU want to engage with countries? How can it do it in a really credible way? And again, not sort of run around with a menu that rarely ever is detailed.
Janis, and then I do want to go out to the room.
I just want to add some. I just want to add something which relates to the politics behind all this, because there are a good number of people also from the migration field who argue that while the issue was not heavily on the agenda, while it was not so strongly discussed, there was slow progress in the system, technical progress in terms of moving in a certain direction, getting to certain compromises, which then allow other compromises to be reached. So there was this appreciation also, by the way, during the Czech presidency, which did make some progress. Now we see that it's again on the high political level. And it is being discussed night long. It is being reported about. We have also people in the European Parliament, like Manfred Weber, using it also in terms of preparing for the next EP elections. So we're seeing that it's becoming increasingly politicized. And there have been questions as to whether is this going to help or is this going to make things more difficult? My answer is, given the experience we have in this field, but also in other fields, that the likelihood is that also in view of upcoming elections, it makes things more difficult.
Indeed.
So instead of moving in the right direction in terms of actual results which are being achieved, and Helena was referring to a lot of things which we've seen on the table on paper, and actually we are making progress or moving in a certain direction, having compromises, the likelihood becomes less if you have this politicization of the issue.
Thank you. Let's take those questions to the audience, and then Fabian, I'll give you a chance to react. Philippe Hamro-Drotz, I have opened your mic. If you could.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this. I have a short comment or question. Migration may be linked to civil society as a whole. Civil society is very heterogeneous, as we know, young, older, different professionals, and so on. Civil society is also already familiar with very cross-border cooperation, not only within Schengen or EU or pan-European. But my question is, do you think that this Council has led to a situation where the cooperation, further cooperation among civil society, pan-European and within, is on threat? That is to say, I'm referring to this Frontier Europe discussion. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much. Let me also take a question from John Palmer, and then I'll come back to you, Helena. John.
Thank you very much. My question, I'm rather astonished that there appears to have been, in the discussion about migration measures, little attention paid to what all the major international economic institutes are saying, IMF, World Bank, you name it, OECD, that the declining demography of the member states of the European Union is becoming a serious and tangible obstacle to growth and indeed even productivity. So has there been no reflection of this steep deterioration of our demographic figures, statistics, in this entire discussion?
Thank you very much, John. Always good to hear from you. And Helena, I mean, I think that also goes back to something Chancellor Scholz did say in the room when he talked about the balance. He was pointing, maybe not so graphically, but to precisely that issue. But is there any discussion around it at the moment, or is it simply because of the politics of the situation just simply being pushed to the side? And the question about the role of civil society in all of this?
So I would say there certainly has been discussion around legal migration. The Commission put forward a legal migration package that contains different kinds of measures. So it's not that it's completely off the agenda, it's just that member states at this point in time are not really very willing to talk about this. And we also have to remember, at least when it comes to sort of the constellation, the architecture of the Commission, demographics are not dealt with, for instance, by Ylva Johansson, the Commissioner on Home Affairs. There's a separate commissioner who's tasked with this. We know that VP Skinas has sort of taken a lead on a legal migration package. So I think all of that goes to show that in the future, and perhaps also under the new Commission, there needs to be stronger coordination between these different portfolios, because it is such an overlapping issue and because it does require that interconnected way of thinking.
Fabian, Janis?
Yeah, I think one of the issues we have whenever we get into this discussion around legal migration is that we then very much look at it from the demand side. We actually say, well, what would help our economies? How would we actually select the right people? And it ignores that ultimately this is something which is far more dynamic, where also the motivations of migrants play a very big role. That all of these issues are connected. We know that people don't like to go to places where they don't feel welcome. So the idea that we can have this kind of, on the one hand, we have, and I'm using a British term here, the hostile environment. But on the other hand, we just want to attract the high level, the right kind of migration. It's just not going to work. But the other point I also wanted to make is on Philip's point, and I would make this actually broader. I think one of the big paradigm shifts which we have to go through in Europe over the next years is to shift from an internal focus to an external focus. We need to start to be much more aware of what is going on around us and how that is going to impact on us and how we can respond to it. But what we are seeing also with this debate on migration is exactly the opposite. I think we are starting to look even more inward than we have in the past. And that, I think, is going to hinder our capability of dealing with these crises, these challenges which we are facing.
Janis.
That's what I was trying to refer to earlier when I was saying that we are portraying the debate, we're having a debate about migration, which is going exactly in the wrong direction, because all the rational arguments, even so, not the rational humanitarian arguments, but the rational economic arguments, which speak in favor of dealing with migration in a different way, is not the debate which we're actually having. So, John, you're right when you're saying all the rational arguments are in favor of dealing with migration in a totally different way. But what we're doing is emotional politics. And what we know is that when it comes to migration, this is something which is deeply emotional for a lot of people, and also for very irrational reasons often. So if we're pushing it in that direction, and it's being pushed also by the discussion which we now had in the context of this European Council, because it is so one-sided that it's pushing the debate into one direction, which at the end of the day does not allow us to do the other rational things we should be doing, while not succumbing to the emotions which have been so much dominating the debate about migration. And if you look into 2015, that was probably the high moment of the emotional debate, but it's going on. And so we're using emotional politics, we're politicizing the issue, and thus we're not doing what Fabian was referring to in terms of the strategy we needed, and Helena was referring to in terms of the actual things we need to do in field A, B, and C.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, but Helena, I want to finish with you and really ask you to answer a question that both Fabian and Janis have posited and answered with their perspectives in terms of their degree of optimism or pessimism for the future. Fabian said earlier, if you get this argument, we can't move at EU level because we can't sell it at home. He feels very gloomy about the prospects of making progress at EU level. Janis pointed to the increasing polarization again, politicization again of this issue as back in 2015 to say he felt it would make it harder to reach a deal. What is your assessment? Is there any prospect, do you think, of the Migration and Asylum Pact being agreed in any meaningful shape, in any meaningful time frame?
So I think it's fair to say that we have to remember that progress has already been made, more so towards the end of this year. And we also know that the European Parliament, in fact, is quite motivated, quite committed to starting negotiations and to really advancing on a number of files. Now, there's talk of starting trialogues on certain files already between March and the beginning of this summer, which seems very ambitious considering that many divisions remain both within the EP, but also within the Council. And we know that there's only really 12 months left or so in order to finish these negotiations. At the moment, we're also seeing that the European Parliament still prefers to adopt everything or nothing. While within the council, there's a bit of a more measured approach. You could say it's often called the gradual approach, where it said, let's work our way sort of one file at a time. Now, these still clash. So I think when it comes to these fundamental questions around solidarity and responsibility sharing, I'm personally not convinced that we will actually see an outcome if you use the European elections in 2024 as a deadline.
And on that rather gloomy note, apologies, ladies and gentlemen, we do try sometimes to finish on an upbeat note, but sometimes it is impossible. But Helena, thank you so much. It was great having you, and thank you for sharing those fabulous insights. I'm sorry, a question has just come in to the audience, but we don't have time to take it. Fabian, Janis, as always, thank you very much. Just a reminder about that evaluation survey. If you haven't had a chance to fill it out because the conversation was so fascinating, you will get an email immediately after this event. Please do fill it out. And just to point you to a few events coming up next week. On Wednesday, a conference on responding to regional challenges, the Transatlantic Alliance in the Western Balkans. On Thursday, a policy dialogue looking at 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, assessing the international response and looking beyond, very much building on what we've been talking about today, and an online policy dialogue on a broad issue, intriguing title, Addressing Today's Crises, Aligning Short-Term Measures with Long-Term Goals. Publications to look out for coming up: a discussion paper on resetting the EU's business model after the watershed, looking at the challenges of European policy coordination, and another discussion paper on reframing cohesion policy with a strategic long-term investment perspective. And Janis, Fabian and I, and a special guest, I hope, will join you again next month when we will look at the outcome of the next summit in March. It only remains me to thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you for your comments and questions. Have a wonderful weekend and see you again soon. Bye and thanks.
Bye.